The first anniversary I want to acknowledge today is my closest friend in the world, Dorothy. It's her birthday today, March 6th. So happy birthday, Dorothy, who I met 28 years ago in New York City. It's also this month, March, is the 28th anniversary of me putting down alcohol for the last time. So and it is this month. But it wasn't March, it was June 4 years ago that I found myself sitting in a hospital waiting room high up above the East River of Manhattan. I was waiting there while my family, my sisters, my two sisters, their kids, my nieces and nephews, my mother were waiting in another waiting room down the hallway. I was separate from them, but we were all waiting to go in to see my father, who was a patient on that floor. And he had been diagnosed with melanoma 3 months before, in March. And I was waiting there for permission from my mother to go in and see him. And always had a fairly difficult relationship with my family. Really, right from the time I was very young. I came out as gay when I was in my early 20s, and although they were a very liberal family, it was cause for them not to speak to me for a couple of years. I also became a writer. And as a writer, 20 years ago this March, I published my first book. And it's an anniversary of that too. And in that book, I wrote about many things. I wrote about being gay. I wrote a lot about sex. I wrote poems about family. And although the poems were very, very fictional, there was emotional truth in those poems that I think hit very close to home for my family. And as a result, they cut me off and didn't speak to me for many, many years after that. I also wrote a great deal about gender. Like Michael, I'm celebrating my 14th year of transition from female to male this year. The second section of that book, which is called Normal Sex, is called Tales of a Lost Boy. That being said, about a year after I started my physical transition, I was living here in Tucson, my parents finally decided to break the ice and to contact me. I had contacted them and my sisters many times over the years. My sisters felt they had to keep me separate from their kids. And they came out to Tucson to visit me. And we had a great day. We visited the Desert Museum, and they enjoyed themselves, I enjoyed it. And it started us reconnecting over the years, so that once a year, twice a year, when I would visit them in New York, we'd see each other, we'd have lunch. I started to develop a very close relationship with my father. I'd always been close to him, but we got closer, and the last time I saw him, December, before his diagnosis, I had lunch with him downtown. He had moved from Cleveland, where I grew up, to New York and started his life over at the age of 50. Became an attorney and really started a whole new life. And he invited me down. After we had lunch, I went up to his office. He introduced me for the first time to his colleagues and felt comfortable enough with himself and with me to introduce me as his son. And I was very grateful without ever having us meet. He also told me during that lunch that he had hoped that my sisters and I would reconcile, that he was turning 80 in a couple of years, and that he hoped before he turned 80 that we would have a reconciliation, and the last thing he wanted was a reconciliation on his deathbed. I told him I had been trying, I had been writing my sisters over the years. They had said no. I think they were waiting for their kids to get older, but he said he'd try on his end. Well, we went on for that we continued talking, and things seemed to be fine until I called him one March day. It was a Sunday. We hadn't talked in a few weeks, so we got on the phone, and his voice was very hoarse. And he sounded hoarse, and I said, "Do you have a cold?" And he said, "No." He said, "I'm fine, but I've had a little procedure." That was his words. "I had a little procedure." Well, it turned out his little procedure was brain surgery, which he had. We're Jewish. I don't know. He didn't want to tell me. He had that about a week before, and he said it was nothing. Well, they found a small tumor on his brain. He had started to have some balance problems, and he said, I think they got everything. I'm fine. They don't think they don't know what it is. It's inconclusive, but I'm okay, and don't worry. By the way, they found some melanoma cells in my lymph nodes, but they think it hasn't spread anywhere, and I'm really fine. I immediately wanted to get on a plane and come out. He said, well, let me talk to your mom and see how that would work. And I talked to him the next day, and he said, look, it's not a good time. Things are very busy and crazy with all of this. Why don't you wait a few months, and we'll be fine. So it seemed like he didn't want me to come. I adhered to what he said. Well, things were fine. He went back to work. He seemed healthy. I talked to him every week, maybe more, and he seemed to be getting better. He was energetic. He was exercising. And things seemed to be good. I stopped worrying so much, and everything was fine. I got a call in June. It was about a week after Memorial Day from my mother. And she told me, it was again a Sunday, that my father was in the hospital. And that he had collapsed over Memorial Day. He couldn't walk, but they didn't know what was going on, and he was having a bunch of tests. Well, when I got off the phone with her, I immediately, without asking her permission, made reservations, got on a plane the next morning, and by that afternoon, it was a Monday, I was in New York City. I went up to the hospital. I saw him there. He was in a room alone. My mother was there. She looked very tired. She looked like she hadn't slept in days. He was pale. He really didn't look that good. He had, machines all hooked up to him, but the first thing he said, oh God, Sam, I'm so glad you're here. And I was very happy too, and my mother left us alone for a while, and we talked. He didn't really want to talk about himself. He said, as soon as my legs work, I'm going to be out of here, I'm going to be fine, but how are you? And he asked me about my work. He always wanted to know about my dog and my wife and how things were going, and I talked to him, and a nurse came in, and she started fiddling and looking at all his statistics, and everything was fine. And she said, Victor, you didn't tell me you had a son. You told me you had 3 daughters. And he just smiled, and he said, oh, this is Sam. And I introduced myself. She was very nice. And I stayed for a little longer. And when I walked out, I saw her. And I went up to her, and I said, I know you're monitoring his cognitive abilities because he had brain surgery. He's fine. You're not hallucinating, or he's not hallucinating. I was his daughter. I'm his son. I transitioned, and I was clear I was not the first trans person she had ever seen in her life. She gave me a hug, and she said, I'm glad you told me, and you have a great father. You're very lucky. And I said, I am very lucky. So I left and went to where I was staying. I got back to the hospital very early the next morning, and the first person I saw was my sister, one of my sisters, who, again, I hadn't seen for 16 years. She looked older. She looked strained, of course. She gave me a hug. I'm sure I looked very different from the last time she saw me. And she said, things are really not that good. Apparently my father had lost his ability to speak overnight. And so I waited. And I got in a chance to see him now and again when they would let me in, and I wouldn't cross over with my nieces and nephews. They were still keeping us very separate. And this went on for 2 days, and I got a chance to spend time with him. I got the chance to tell my sisters that he wanted us to be together, and the 3 of us went in and talked to him, even though he had lost consciousness by that time. And I told him that it was important for me and for all of us to heal, and I think he heard me. And so I waited in that waiting room until I was allowed in, and 2 days went by, and I suddenly got this urge. I needed to leave. The hospital was just so claustrophobic. I just felt through my whole body, and things were stable. His vitals were fine. I called my mother. She said, look, go for a walk. I'll call you if anything happens. And so I did, and I felt like this energy was pushing me out of that hospital room. And I left. I had 10 blocks to go uptown, and I felt, again, like the wind was just at my back. I don't know how I got there. I lost track of time, but I walked into a church where I found a young man talking about the fact that he had stopped drinking about a year ago. And as I walked in, I was late, he said that one of the things that happened once he gave up alcohol was like a veil had lifted, and he felt like he saw the face of God, these were his words, in the face of everyone he talked to, whether he knew them or not. And it was a great gift to him. And as he talked, I thought I heard my father, because my father was that kind of person. He could sit and look at you, and you always felt like you were heard, like he was the only person listening to you, and you were the only person in the room. And you always felt like he was very present. Well, after about 5 minutes, I got a phone call, and it was my mother. I stepped out of the church, and she said, "You better come now, and come quickly." And so I did. I got in a cab. I rushed down. I don't know how I got there. The next thing I knew, the cabbie was asking for money. I ran up to the room. My mother was there, my 2 sisters, their husbands, and everyone was sobbing. They were standing around the bed, and my father had already passed. I burst into tears, and I put my arms out, and my sisters and my mother, everybody helped me, and I helped them. And we sat there with my father for a long time as a family. After a while, and it was time to leave, and my sister came up to me and she said, "Sam, I know this is really hard, but we're all gathering at Mom's house tonight, and I hope you're okay, but we can't have you there. We're going to just need to be with each other, and I know you had a good and wonderful separate relationship with your father, but we need to be with the people who have shared this life with him." So I took it. I wasn't going to fight them at that moment. And I was fortunate to have some very, very good friends in town. My friend Dorothy, whose birthday it is today, came down, and some other friends came. My wife came the next day. We had the funeral. I went to sit Shiva with them all. After 2 hours, I was asked to leave. My wife and I were asked to leave. And I realized, I looked at my mother, and she was in such grief. They'd been married for 57 years. And I realized what a secret I had been in that family. And I had been a secret, even though I had this relationship ongoing with my parents. And although it's hard to understand, I did understand my mother's shame and my mother's grief and her inability to deal with me. And in her grief, she just couldn't. It was too much for her when people came up to her and said, "It was so nice to meet Sam. Where's he been all these years?" And that understanding has grown. But one of the things about that whole time that I remember, and I kept being so hard on myself that I wasn't there when my father passed. And I kept wondering how come I wasn't there. And then it occurred to me that something else might have been going on. I kept thinking about that strange energy in my body that took me over, and it occurred to me that maybe it was my father who, knowing it was the end game, and not wanting to go, but knowing it was the end, needed me to leave, needed me to lead him out of that hospital room, needed me to feel the air, to feel the wind in my back as I walked up those 10 blocks, needed me to go into that church, needed me to hear that young man speaking and my father speaking through him to tell me that I could see the face of God or Spirit in everyone's face that I looked at, and that I could listen and be present and hear everyone as they spoke. And that no matter what, that no matter how new a person was to me, or even how much they hurt me, that I could see the face of God. And the more I thought about it, the more it made sense. And the more I knew it was true. Thank you.